Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Black Titan, A.G. Gaston, and the Making of a Black American Millionaire by Carol Jenkins and Elizabeth Gardner Hines. The book tells the story of an entrepreneur who became the first, or at least one of the first, Black millionaires in America. A.G. Gaston was the grandson of slaves and came of age at a time when many Black people in the South were struggling as a result of the end of Reconstruction and the emergence of Jim Crow. Seeing a bleak future lurking in mining, Gaston began to recognize and take advantage of opportunities to provide services to co-workers and later the broader community. This knack for seeing a need and filling it would result in a sprawling business empire that would also provide support for the civil rights movement. So the book Black Titan is about A.G. Gaston, an entrepreneur, importantly a Black entrepreneur who was born and raised in the South and founded several companies, becoming one of the first Black millionaires. He's believed to have been the wealthiest Black man in America, or at least was referred to as such. And so this book is written by some of his family members, a niece and I believe another relative. They shed some light on his life. It's in a sense a biography, both about the man and about his philosophy, how he moved through life and things like that. And from the outset, what I enjoyed about this book was just in listening to the prologue, you get some understanding of the author's relationship with their uncle, right? As far as growing up in a relatively normal family in New York, but then having this wealthy relative that lived in the South who would sometimes, come to visit or pass through on their way traveling, wherever by plane or boat, spending the summers down at his house at the home that he shared with her aunt, to whom she was actually related by blood. Spending the summer with her cousins at his house, and just the impact of spending time in that environment and with such a person, being in close contact with him and having the opportunity to speak with him about his life and to gain some understanding on a personal level. What I enjoyed about the book is certainly within the prologue, you get that insight into their personal relationship. And I was kind of concerned because I find that sometimes when family members write books about their well-known family members, if the person is famous entertainer or whatever the case might be, I understand their loyalty, right? But what tends to happen in a lot of cases is that the book or the movie might shake out in one of two ways, where either out of a sense of loyalty to the subject, they gloss over their flaws and shortcomings, staying away from the more controversial topics and moments from the subject's life, or there's some kind of bitterness or family turmoil, or at least just a willingness to take advantage of the opportunity to, write a tell-all book or a movie or something like that, where they really portray the person in the worst light possible. So I was actually a little bit apprehensive when I started reading the book. I realized that it was a family member, because I thought it was going to be one of those two things. But in reading the book, once I got past the prologue, I actually thought it was pretty refreshing that the author was quite fair in her portrayal of Gaston, in the sense that certainly she spoke to his good points and positive qualities, but then also didn't shy away from possibly controversial topics. And so with that, it made me lean more into the book, because I felt that while certainly, it'd be influenced by this individual's perspective and their relationship, that as much as possible, you would get an unbiased account of Gaston's life. Another thing, once the book began proper, what I enjoy, especially in biographies and autobiographies of this nature, where it's like the telling about an individual whose life began quite some time in the past, outside of my lifetime. I was alive when he was alive, but by that point he was a very old man, and we only overlapped for like a few years possibly, right? This is someone who was around in the 1800s, early 1900s, several decades ago. And I like it when a book gives you, especially when people come from smaller communities, when books give you insight into the individual, but also the environment from which they came. So in the case here, Gaston actually comes from a relatively small community in Alabama, and you get some history of not just him, but the place of his birth, right? These people who would loom large in his life and have an impact on him. You get a brief biography of his grandparents, his mother, even his father, who unfortunately passed away when he was a small child. But I like that the book didn't just start off with him, or the book doesn't just start off with him already being successful, but rather it began even before him, right? Speaking about really going back to slavery, where his grandparents had been enslaved. And so by the time he was born, it was like 30, 40 years after the end of slavery, his grandparents were still alive, so they could offer some insight into that experience. His mom had been born free right at the tail end of slavery. And so with that, he knew his mom, he knew his grandparents, and through that relationship, and especially because he was very young at the time of his father's passing, his mom left him with his grandparents in search of opportunities to provide for herself and for him. And so staying with his grandparents, it had a tremendous impact on him, their outlook on life, their philosophy. They handed down to him what they shared with him a lot. During the time that he spent with his grandparents, they told him to some degree about their lives during slavery, which is actually quite valuable, because in reading other books, what I find is that, not saying all, but quite a few people, once slavery ended, those who had been enslaved, it's like they wanted as much as possible, which is understandable, to just put those experiences behind them, to not think about them or relive them. You know, people don't want to share their experiences during slavery with younger family members, or those that did share their experiences, within a few generations, the family would kind of move away from sharing those experiences with younger family members. But here you have it where his grandparents, I believe his grandfather in particular, didn't shy away from sharing these experiences with Gaston. He spoke about what day-to-day life was like being enslaved and then coming out of slavery. There's an explanation, not to say that he was privileged financially, but in a sense because of the positions that his grandparents had held during slavery, where unlike a lot of other enslaved people who worked in the fields and agricultural pursuits, following slavery, that's what they knew how to do. His grandfather was a groom. His grandmother was a cook in like the slave master's house. And so when slavery ended, they were able to use those skills, to use those experiences to provide for themselves instead of getting sucked into this system of sharecropping that would hold a lot of other Black people in financial bondage, pretty much keeping them in similar positions to when they had been enslaved. But just by virtue of his grandparents happening to have worked in these positions that allowed them to get out of the fields, they were able to stay out of the fields once slavery ended. And with that, they were able to avoid some of the debt that other formerly enslaved people found themselves crushed under. Through that, they were able to purchase a home, some land, other things along those lines. And in time, they became independent in a sense that the people around them and the Black people in the South, you know, on a whole, were unable to achieve, right? Many were unable to be. And so I thought that was actually pretty eye-opening. It's sort of this thing of, if you think of generational wealth, there's a discussion about literacy in the book, how limited opportunities for education in the South, for everyone, but especially for Black people. This data point that the literacy of parents greatly affects literacy and then the prospects for children and for generations on down the line. And so, as is explained here, because of his grandparents, his grandmother at least, you know, being like the treasurer of the local church, her position in the big house, and then later her job, where both the grandmother and grandfather at least had some understanding of math. And then his mother, it's unclear exactly how literate they were, but they at least knew math, right? There was a likelihood that they could also read and possibly write. That played a role in his eventual success, in part because him attending school, him getting some kind of an education and learning some kind of skill was regarded as being important by his parents, by his grandparents and mother, right? The people that raised him. So with this, we get some insight into the history of the era of his birth, the place where he comes from, which was a rather small community. And so that was pretty interesting. There's an explanation and breakdown of Black codes, Jim Crow, which are things I've read elsewhere, but it was interesting to see here how his grandpa, his grandparents, their economic situation in 2 generations, it kind of paved the way for him to go on and become successful. This idea of the grandparents achieving what they did in life, but then the expectation that each generation would do a little bit better really helped to play a role in his eventual development and his eventual success. I mean, he still had to get out there and work for it, but I think that reality is actually quite insightful. You know, you get to learn a little bit about his early life and sort of from a very young age. I think seeing the examples around him played a very important role in the vision that he saw for himself. where despite the times and despite the limitations being placed upon Black people, the lack of opportunity and resources being offered to Black people, here you have it that Gaston's grandparents and his mother, as well as other people that he came into contact with, were constantly repeating to him, that he was smart and capable of doing great things, where despite the limitations that society, broader society, might have attempted to put on him, the people around him encouraged him to dream big, to go after things in life, to be ambitious, to want more for himself. And so in addition to that, you also see the importance of representation, where a simple thing like the community that he was growing up in, so many of the Black people worked in agriculture. They worked as sharecroppers and other things along those lines. But him seeing his grandparents having different kinds of jobs, owning their own home, things of that nature influenced him. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but seeing there was a Black man in town who had completed high school and now worked as a clerk in a store, it showed him that there were other opportunities and avenues out there that he could pursue. And so from a very young age, just seeing this Black guy working as a clerk in the store where everyone else was working, or most other people were working in agriculture, it gave him an example. It gave him something to aspire to, that he could do more, that what was being readily presented to him. He eventually moved to Birmingham with his mom and was exposed to other experiences. His mom pushed him towards interacting and socializing with middle class and upper middle class Black people. The change in environment and these relationships allowed him to further imagine what could be possible. So it's like, had he remained in this environment where everyone was doing the same thing, where he didn't see examples of doing things differently, potential things that he could do to elevate himself, and then also with the encouragement from his family and the people around him, he might have ended up on a very different path in life. But from a very young age, it's explained that how he stayed out of trouble was this little kernel of vision that the adults around him planted in him, that he could go on to do great things. This idea he had from a young age of being financially independent, being an entrepreneur, although he probably wasn't thinking of it in those terms. This idea that he could go on to do great things, it was just a matter of figuring out what that would be and looking for the opportunity. But having that instilled in him from a young age helped to guide and shape him as he was getting older. It's the thing that kind of kept him out of trouble. His guardians, his parents instilling in him to stay away from trouble, to watch who he was hanging around, to pursue positive things that were going to help him to progress in life, rather than getting involved in things that might bring him problems or get him into trouble. And so with that, you really get a sense of how important it is for children to be surrounded with positivity, both in the sense of what people say to them, and then also in terms of the examples that are set for them. So as the book progresses, we get a lot of insight into Gaston's early life. And I think something that's actually pretty telling is that in recent years, when you speak about entrepreneurship, there's a lot of focus on the use of tech entrepreneurs, tech companies, things like that. A lot of stories focus on these people being in their 20s and 30s, right? Founding these companies that become insanely popular or garner a lot of investments within a short period of time. These really large valuations. But the reality is that for most businesses, it takes quite a bit of time to build up a company. And most entrepreneurs are successful. For some, that might be that they start a few companies before they really hit on that big idea. As part of that, they tend to be a bit older. I could be wrong about the exact number, but I think most successful entrepreneurs, they don't really hit on that successful idea until like their 40s. But because of the interest in the story of success and business coming fast and, entrepreneurs being young, I think in part because of America's obsession with youth, you get a skewed idea of what an entrepreneur looks like. Not to say that things certainly have changed in recent times, because given the internet, I think it's easier to start companies and with less financial investment. You can start companies in a different way than maybe in the past. But it's interesting to see here, to read about the various false starts that Gaston had, and that really he had an ambition to be an entrepreneur, to be financially independent, financially secure. But given the time in which he was born, given that he started out not very wealthy, not super poor either. He had like some false starts along the way. He had various menial jobs, really just trying to work his way into success, and realized that wasn't getting him to where he wanted to be. I think it's fortunate in a way. You can take a lot away from the book in that sense, because it shows that not that he made mistakes, but things kind of went wrong for him early on in life. And it plays into this idea of rejection being protection, or that things don't necessarily in the moment. It might seem like things are happening to you, but long term, they happen for you. It's all about, you might have a negative experience or something might not go your way, but that doesn't necessarily mean you've taken a loss. It just means that it's an opportunity for you to learn from, for you to grow from, and for you to then take those things you've learned and apply them in the future, so that it puts you more firmly on the path, or helps you along your path to success. And so in reading about him, going overseas as part of the military with this vision that he'd come back and it would enable him to get a good job, coming back and realizing that America had not changed even after serving in World War I, that he went through this sacrifice, he went through all of this hardship only to come back to America and to find himself unable to find a job. And with that, then finding menial jobs that weren't really paying that much, kind of being led astray by individuals that he hoped to form a friendship with, losing his job, and then as sort of last resorts, going to work in the mines, something that he really did not want to do. And I'm not saying that you should seek out dangerous work or anything like that, but it goes to show you that sometimes in life, you have to take a step back to take a step forward. That's how things work sometimes. And in this case, the very thing that he had been running away from, working in the mines because it's dangerous work, ended up kind of providing the opportunity for him to see potential business ideas. That during the time in which he started his first business, seeing a need in the mines, the mining setup was organized for workers where he could take advantage and function as a lending institution, starting a catering business with his mom. He didn't become this great business titan overnight, but he started out with these small little jobs, little companies providing services, and they grew over time. He reinvested his profits, bought into other companies, took opportunities to expand and take advantage of them. It shows the reality. It's a more realistic picture of how businesses are built, of how people succeed in business. It's not like you have an idea in 2 years and 2 days later you become successful. There might be a period of time where you might be working really hard for long stretches, putting in a lot of work. And so it was interesting to see over the course of years, decades really, how he built up this business empire. But then as you get into the 50s and 60s, that he had various setbacks along the way, both personal and professional. And getting into the 50s and 60s, he'd been dealing with racism from the time of his birth, but kind of finding different ways to work around it. In some regard, actually, being able to negotiate and work with others, where despite the environment, he was able to achieve a degree of success by being able to work with difficult people. Certainly he would face some criticism for that, but as the book moves into the civil rights era, it was interesting to get this continued history of not just him, but also the environment of Birmingham and the surrounding area, where actually he was run out of town, right? A small town where he'd been living and having success, but due to that, there was some discomfort with a Black man being successful in the area. It was a suburb of Birmingham, I think, Fairfield or Fremont was the name of the place. And so this is kind of where he started off his business, right? He had firmly established himself in business, achieved some degree of comfort and success, but then was basically run out of town. And from there, relocated to Birmingham. And it's like, again, this thing of something seeming like a setback or negative, but really turning out to be a positive, because in moving to Birmingham and his Birmingham proper and his prominence there, like when the civil rights movement took off in the 50s and 60s, he then played a tremendous role in that just by virtue of the position he held in the local society and the local community. Having an understanding of economics, business, yes, but specifically within his story and beyond that, you get a history of Birmingham. It's a really interesting book. I don't want to go too into detail about it. In this book, you certainly have a biography of Gaston, but you also learn quite a bit. I think there's quite a bit to learn here from a business perspective for entrepreneurs. There's also some history, economics, right? How these various things played a role in the history of Black people in Birmingham. So I think it's a really interesting book to check out. Granted, as part of this, it's interesting to see that because of his success, his willingness to work within the segregationist society, that he actually butted heads with Martin Luther King Jr. and regarded him as a radical, whereas Gaston in some quarters was regarded as an Uncle Tom, but played a significant role in the local civil rights movement in Birmingham, simply because he was one of the few people able to provide the financial backing needed by the local movement. And so you get that lesser known but equally important story. Gaston might be less well known in the years since his death, but his story is both inspirational and also a sort of guidebook for entrepreneurs, which I highly recommend checking out. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.